Hello, I'm Rabbi Elton from the Great Synagogue in Sydney, and welcome to From the Rabbi's Bookshelves. One of the greatest challenges facing traditional Judaism in the last 200 years has been biblical criticism. The idea that instead of the Torah being a unified text given by God to Moses, it was written by many people over a long period. That really undermines the central basis of Jewish practice and Jewish life. In the 19th century and the early 20th century, many people became involved in arguing for the traditional view, including Rabbi Dr. Hertz, Rabbi Hoffman, Benno Jacob, but the area lay fallow for most of the second half of the 20th century until this book came along very recently, Maamin, Biblical Criticism, Historical Truth, and the 13 Principles of Faith by Joshua Berman. Rabbi Dr. Berman is the Professor of Bible at Bar-Ilan University, a university in Israel. He's a graduate of Princeton, and he's an academic Bible scholar. And he argues that if we look carefully at the text, and in particular, we look at the texts which surrounded the Bible of a similar age, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and some of the tablets discovered in the Near East, then we find compelling evidence that, in fact, the Torah is a single unitary work of the age of Moses. I want to give just one example from his essays on different parts of the Bible in which he examines and presents this case. Looking at the story of Noah, it had previously been argued by academic Bible scholars that in fact the story of Noah contains two different previous narratives, which came from two different traditions and were knitted together at some later date. What Rabbi Berman points out is twofold. First of all, if you look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, which also has a flood story, although rather different in its form, you find that the points of narrative in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in the Torah's account match point by point. The ethical lesson is different, and some of the details are different, but the points of the narrative structure are exactly the same. And Berman says, how can it be? You'd have two different sources knitted together, and yet the final product matches perfectly a contemporary account from a different civilization. It implies the Torah's account is of the same age as the Epic of Gilgamesh is, and it's not the result of two different sources somehow fudged together. Secondly, he points out a very elaborate chiastic structure. Chiasmus is a structure along these lines, A, B, B, A. And you can find this running through the entire story of the Noah and the flood. So the first element of the story parallels the very last element, and the second, the penultimate, and so on and so forth. This is, in fact, over many, many different stages, and we will take a look at all of the stages of this chiastic structure here in the volume. This is how he concludes this essay on the story of Noah. This chapter, like the one before it, highlights the necessity of examining the literary conventions of the Torah in the light of those of the ancient Near East. The 18th and 19th century scholars who invented source criticism, that is to say, taking apart the Torah into its supposed constituent sources, did so with no recourse to the writings of the ancient Near East, because they were unknown until the late 19th century. Perforce, they examined the text of the Tanakh, that is to say, the Hebrew Bible, with the only notions of literary unity they knew, their own. But findings such as the Gilgamesh epic and the discovery of chiastic structure in a wide array of ancient texts open our eyes to the realization that we read texts from within the fishbowl of our own literary assumptions. These ancient resources demand of us intellectual modesty. They demand of us that before we pass judgment on a text, we had better first check out our assumptions and do all we can to master the thought and writing of ancient writers, so as to read the text as best we can within the literary canons of ancient times rather than our own. Berman's point is not that we should insist on the Torah's unity through some sort of dogmatic statement, but that true scholarship, looking at the text and the surrounding text, will reveal that in fact the traditional position has been correct all along. Thanks for joining.